couple of songs tonight, but let's sing some good old prayerful hymns. Let's take our songbooks, turn to page number 446. Take time to be holy. 446. Take time to be holy. Take time to be holy. Speak off with the Lord. Abide in him always and feed on his word. Make friends of God's children. Help those who are weak. Forgetting in nothing his blessings to seek. Take time to be holy. The world rushes on. Spend much time in secret with Jesus alone. By looking to Jesus, like him thou shalt be. Thy friends and thy conduct his likeness shall see. Take time to be holy, let him be thy guide, and run not before him, whate'er betide. In joy or in sorrow, still follow the Lord, and looking to Jesus, still trust on his word. Take time to be holy, be calm in thy soul. Each thought and each motive beneath his control. Thus led by his Spirit to fountains of love, thou soon shalt be fitted for service above. Let's go right across the page, Sweet Hour of Prayer. Right across the page. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer that calls me from a world of care and bids me at my Father's throne make all my wants and wishes known. In seasons of distress and grief, my soul has often found relief, and oft escape the tempter's snare by thy return, sweet hour of prayer. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, thy wings shall my petition bear. To him whose truth and faithfulness engage the waiting soul to bless. And since he bids me seek his face, believe his word and trust his grace, I'll cast on him my every care and wait for thee, sweet hour of prayer. Sweet hour of prayer, sweet hour of prayer, may I thy consolation share, till from Mount Pisgah's lofty height I view my home and take my flight. This robe of flesh I'll drop and rise to seize the everlasting bride. and shout while passing through the air. Farewell, farewell, sweet hour of prayer. Great song, isn't it? Great song. Great song. Thank you, Sandy.
As we sang about a sweet hour of prayer, we're going to have our time of prayer normally at the end, but we need to have prayer now. So, Sister Leanne, would you open us in prayer, please? Turn your Bibles tonight to the book of Joshua, chapter 9. And just for the update, the trustees did meet, and I'm going to monitor the smell this week. And if we believe there is another skunk under this building, it is going to a professional something. They are going to be taking care of it, not us, because we're getting done with this. So that's just to let you know, good news, but we just pray there's nothing in there, that it's just residual, but it really didn't smell like residual coming up from the sound booth this morning. So, did I say sound or smell? It didn't sound or smell like residual. All right, chapter 9 of Joshua. What I'm gonna do is, as I go through verse by verse, I'm gonna read that verse and that way, if I don't get all the way through with chapter 9, I'll be able to pick up again next week. But you know, as we just got off of Joshua's coming off the hills of the defeat of Ai, like out of chapter 8, and that they had beaten Ai because they had been obedient to God's command. I've titled this tonight, "Don't Be Deceptive." Has anybody ever been deceptive? Everybody's head should have done this because you've been deceptive. We've been deceptive. But what is deception? And tonight, as we look at this deception in this chapter, I want to parallel with not only our lives as individuals, but parallel it also with the church. Because allowing deception in our own lives is a lack of what I've preached on the last 3 weeks on Sunday morning. But the same goes for allowing deception in the church, and we'll get to what that deception means in a minute. But we have to remember that God expects his children to be obedient. You know, a while ago, Damien was at the back door, and I was just giving him a hard time, and I said, "Hey!" And he just almost went to attention. And Erica goes, "I've trained him right." And I said, "Yes." But you know, that's what God expects of us. That's really what God expects you to do and I to do when he speaks. And say, stop and say, "Yes, what do you want? What do I need to do, God? What is it that I am needing to do in order to follow your commands to the letter?" Israel had been told by Moses, if you want to enter the promised land, you've got to follow God's commands to the T. You've got to follow every instruction, just as God has given it. You have to follow it. And then Moses himself didn't follow it. Then we go on and find Joshua, and Joshua's leading here, and we saw in chapter 8, I think it was last week, that Joshua had someone in the Israelite camp that did not follow it. And then we're going to find out that this week, Joshua and the elders did not follow obedience. And so, you know, as we go all the way back to chapter 7, it was where Israel was defeated, or Joshua chapter 1, verse 7, it's where it said, "Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to do according to all the law that Moses, my servant, commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that ye may have good success wherever you go. Folks, God was very specific, not only here in Joshua, but in all of his word, but he was very specific. He said to do according to all, and do not turn away to the left or to the right. So God says, do everything that I've told you, do all that I've told you, and when you're doing it, don't, sometimes we say we shouldn't have blinders on, but there's a certain time as Christians we have to have blinders on as well. We have to be able to understand when that time and concept is that I need blinders on. Folks, in our Christian walk, we need blinders on. But in our Christian outreach, we need our blinders off. We need to be able to reach out to and be open to seeing those that are in need. But these words were very specific to Joshua. Do according to all, and do not turn from the right or the left. And he says, if you do that, you will have success wherever you go. Now, these words ring true, I think, today, just like they did here in Joshua. But Joshua's going to make a major mistake. We're going to see that Joshua made a major mistake by not following God's words. And I want you to hear this last word, exactly. Now, I'm looking out, most of you are parents, and you've said this to your child. You do exactly as I say. See, you knew it. You don't want them to stray from what you're telling them to do. I remember because we lived in the country and I got told, like I was about Destiny's age, I was always wanting to go to the mailbox. That's like a quarter of a mile to the highway. And then you cross the highway and I was begging to go. And I'll never forget Mom saying, you do it exactly as I say. And I did that time. Later on it became different. But anyway, let's go to chapter 9. And this is a really fun chapter because we can see I shouldn't say fun, it's a very learning chapter where we as a church should be able to learn where we need to be at all times. And then next week will be Blaine's favorite passage, I think, in the Bible is where the moon stood still in chapter 10 of Joshua. But as we go here, verse 1 and 2, it says, when all the kings heard about Jericho and Ai, who were west of the Jordan in the hill country, in the Judean foothills, and all along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, toward Lebanon, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, they formed a unified alliance to fight against Joshua and all of Israel. So, back when Jericho was defeated, there became an alliance of a group of kings that they said, hey, listen, they're going to kick our tail, so we're going to make an agreement that we're going to fight together in unison. We're going to become NATO, if you will. Well, that's kind of what we think as NATO is today. It's the fight against everybody. But they said, we're going to hold true against Israel. We're going to have an alliance to fight. But if we go back to chapter 5, verse 1, the same kings that had feared in their hearts because of the Jordan crossing, they changed that heart at the defeat of Ai, or before the defeat of Ai. But somehow they had hope and they joined the forces that, hey, you know what? Ai held them off, we can do it too. They held them off for a little bit, so we can do it too. So we get to verse 3, and verse 3 says, when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard that what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, I'm going to read verse 4 too. They acted deceptively, they gathered provisions and took worn out sacks on their donkeys and old wineskins, cracked and mended. I'll read 5 as well. They wore old, cracked and mended. I believe I didn't jump a verse or a line. They wore old patched sandals on their feet and threadbare clothing on their bodies. Their entire provision of bread was dry and crumbly. So Gibeons had heard that Joshua and Israel had done to Jericho and Ai. So they plotted out to scheme or to trick Joshua into thinking they were someone they are not. Now, this is where I want us to really pay attention as a church, that we have to be so cautious right here. When people try to come into the church, we have to make sure what their understandings and their feelings are, because there are people that will try to infiltrate a church to split it. Did you know that? There are people that will try to come in, and that's what actually is going to happen is happening here in Joshua. But they decided to try to join Israel instead of defeat them, which makes a pretty smart attempt on their part, but it made a really bonehead move on Joshua and the elders' part, because they knew what they were to do. Because I'm going to read what they were to do. Out of Deuteronomy 20, 16 and 18, this is the command to Moses. And as they destroy all the peoples in Canaan. Notice it says all the peoples. But in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes. But you shall devote them to complete destruction, the Hittites and the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, as the Lord has commanded you, that they may not teach you to do according to all their abominable practices that they have done for their gods, and so you sin against the Lord your God. Gibeon wanted to look like they'd come from a faraway country. Now, being a pastor, at Roby, we had a call system set up in the area that if someone was pretty normal to be knocking on the church's door and doing this, we kept record. And we had found out that through the time I was there, because I was there a long time, that every 3 years we would usually see the cycle come through of the same people, of wanting handouts. And then when I'd say, well, we handed out to you twice already, and they're like, well, no. And I'm like, yeah. And I could show them, well, Joshua's not doing this. He's not being a very good agent of intelligence seeking here. And since they wanted to look like they come from a faraway land, they did what? They put on old clothes. Kind of like how I felt when I walked out tonight. I thought, you didn't even change from your afternoon dress, but I wasn't wearing a dress. Let me rephrase that. My afternoon attire. But they were serious about deceiving the Israelites. So they dressed in old clothes. They had wineskins that were cracked. Their sandals were wore out and patched. Their food was dry and moldy and crumbly. Everything looked like it was legit. It's like it's really real. So they said, hey, we come from a faraway land. Verse 6. They went to Joshua in the camp of Gilgal and said to him and the men of Israel, we have come from a distant land. Please make a treaty with us. Gibeon was a city north of Jerusalem in the territory of the tribe of Benjamin. So it's north of Jerusalem. And they were only about 25 miles probably from Jerusalem. But they had made it look like they were coming from a way, way far away land, and that they were so worn out and so tired. And we'll discuss that more in verse 15 if we get that far, which we're going to. But they were wanting a treaty or a covenant with Israel. But before I go much further, I want to say that a treaty or a covenant in the Old Testament was binding. It was a done deal. You could not renege on what you had said you were going to do if you made this a treaty. So, verse 7, we have, the men of Israel replied with the Hivites, perhaps you live among us. So they had a little thought of intelligence of saying, well, hey, maybe you live among us. How can we make a treaty with you? How do we know that you're not trying to deceive us? They said to Joshua, we are your servants. We are your servants. Who are you and where do you come from? Joshua asked them. They replied to him, "Your servants have come from a far away land because of the reputation of the Lord your God, for we have heard of his fame and all he did in Egypt." I'm going to read through 13. Trying to keep up my notes here. And all that he did to the Amorite kings beyond the Jordans, Sihon, king of Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who was in Ashtaroth. So our elders and all the inhabitants of our land told us, "Take provisions with you for the journey. Go and meet them and say, 'We are your servants. Please make a treaty with us. This bread of ours was warm when we took it from our houses as food on the day we left to come to you. But look at it now. It is crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them, but look, they're cracked, and these clothes and sandals on our feet are worn out and from our extremely long journey.'" They made a confession that was really pretty awesome. I don't know if you caught it in there, but they confessed that your God is awesome. They said, "Because of the power of your God, Joshua, that you worship, we want to make a treaty with you." Even though they were lying about where they come from, they said, "We want to make a treaty with you." And they're doing this to save their own hides. They're doing this so that they don't get annihilated, as God has instructed Moses to tell Joshua, and then Joshua to tell the people, that you annihilate every one of these places I send you. Folks, that's the problem. That's why we still have a problem in the world today in the Middle East, is because Joshua did not finish the job that was set before him, which God already knew. But they had heard of God's reputation and his fame, but they didn't say anything. As I was reading through this, I noticed they didn't say anything about having victories over Jericho and Ai. And I thought, I wonder why that is. And I believe it is because if they would have said, "Hey, well, we know you had victories over Jericho and Ai," then they would have known, well, they're not from a faraway country because they've heard something from us. So they have to be. So they're getting sucked in. Has anybody ever been sucked in? Deceived? Let me see how I phrase this. Some people I know really well got a phone call about a year ago from a grandson that was in Florida, and he was in jail. And they needed $30,000 to get him out of jail. And this family tried to get around the $30,000 and then realized he was at work at Lowe's in Rolla. He wasn't in, but it was his voice. It sounded like him. They made everything look deceptionally or sound deceptionally like it was this person, but it wasn't this person. And that's what these folks are trying to do. They're trying to say, "Hey, look at us. We come from so far away." And their credentials, what did they use as credentials? Because credentials are important. They dress like bums, as we would call them. They dressed like bums in old clothes and worn out clothes, and their food was old and moldy. I love the fact that it said, "Listen, our bread was hot when we took it out of the oven, but now it's crumbly." Most bread is hot when you take it out of the oven, as a matter of fact, unless you forget it and shut it off and forgive it. But the sandals, their wineskins, everything was worn out. And that seemed to ease the suspicion of Joshua and his men. It seemed to allow them to drop their guard. And this is what I want us to get tonight, if we get nothing else. We as a church have to constantly be on guard. Be on guard. We believe in certain things doctrinally about this book. We believe that it was written by God, written by men, given to God through the power of the inspiration of the Spirit of God. And every word in it is true from Genesis 1 to Revelation 33. Thank you. Revelation 22. It's all God's inspired word. And so we take that word, and we cannot in a moment drop our guard and allow infiltration of a false doctrine to come in. Now, I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I'm just going to say it. Joel Osteen's dad was a Southern Baptist preacher. Did you know that? His dad was a good Southern Baptist man and held true to. But I can tell you right now, Joel's not holding true to. He's allowed the world to seep into his ministry. And I'm not bad-mouthing Joel Osteen, so don't take that as wrong. I'm just telling you that we've got to be wary, because I believe that he was worldly sucked in, kind of like Joshua and the Israelites were sucked in. And I've seen other churches, and I just used them for a reference because they're a big church. But you know, even the little churches can be infiltrated. There was one just not far from here that left our association not too long ago because of a doctrinal issue came about, and they left the Southern Baptists, and it was because of infiltration of those with a different doctrine than what that church had. But verses 14 and 15 is where we see them mess up. The men of Israel took some of their provisions, but did not seek the Lord's counsel. So where did they mess up? I just read it right there. They did not seek the Lord's counsel. So Joshua established the Lord's counsel. Man, I'm having trouble dropping. Maybe if I turn my head this way. So Joshua established peace with them and made a treaty to let them live, and the leaders of the community swore an oath to them. Remember when I talked about the oath earlier, that there is an oath in the Old Testament, when a covenant or a promise was made, it was a done deal. Like back in the 60s, when you shook hands with somebody, that was a deal. That's all it took, was a handshake, and it was finalized. Well, here in the Old Testament, Joshua makes a deal with I can't even remember who I was talking about now. The Gibeonite. Let me find them. Yeah, the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites. I was wanting to say Gibeon, and then I was wanting to go to Gideon, but anyway, and it says it right here in my verse 14 notes, the Gibeonites. But they made the treaty. But they made it because of a tale, a long, tall story that was told. Now, I've been taken as a pastor by people that come in and they're wanting a handout, and they give me this long, sorry tale, and sometimes I'm just a sucker for bad news. Anybody else ever been that way? And you're like, well, you know what, and then you find out they have totally scammed you. Scammed you as a church, scammed you as a person. And it's because I can almost guarantee it was due to the fact that I didn't do at least, what was in verse 14, and that was seek the counsel, the direction of God. So that's why I'm so glad at Ozark Baptist Church that all benevolence goes through the deacons. And that's where it should be. Oh, well, I don't have the problem of having to mess with it. We can just say, hey, fill out this little form. We'll send it to the deacons will take care of it. And then after that, it's on their heads, not mine. I say that jokingly, but it's good. You've got 7 men then deciding what to do, whether or not. And I pray they're taking counsel. But they didn't seek God in their direction, their decision. This was a mistake of their trust in their own judgment. A mistake in the trust of your own judgment. How many times has your own judgment got you in a pickle? Your own judgment of things got you in trouble because you thought, well, you know, it'll be okay. I'll jump this one time from 40 feet. I lived through it, but still, it was a long ways down. And then I realized, as old and as fat as I was, it was a lot longer getting up out of the water. You don't take that stuff into consideration as you're going down. But Brother Ron, you do as you're coming up. Because you're thinking, my air is not going to last till I reach the top. So sometimes our judgment is a little clouded, and mine was clouded that day because of pride. For those of you that don't know the story, most of you probably do. We We were near Gatlinburg. We were in the Smoky Mountains, and there's this about 40-foot bluff and a beautiful hole of water, just pristine, ice cold water. And these people were just jumping off of it, one right after another. Young kids and median adults, and me in my 40s got up there. My sons both jump, pop out of the water, and they're going to get in line again. And I walk up, and my head started going like this. I took a step back, and this lady that was about my age steps up beside me and goes, "Wimp," and jumps. So my distortion of my thought process became pride. This woman about my age just told me I was a chicken. So you know what I had to do? And it was the last time I jumped, and it will be the last time I ever jump if I even go back there. Because I seriously thought I was going to drown before. You think you can see the water and you're going, but you just the top, but you can't get there? And I realized then that I was getting older and I should be making better decisions. It was a valuable lesson for me, but it was a valuable lesson that I can use to compare to this with Joshua. Joshua should have already learned to be on guard, not to allow anything to infiltrate the Israelites. Do not allow, to always be seeking of God. And that treaty, that oath, it bound them. It could not be broken. So they had to honor this treaty. In verses 16 and 17, it says, 3 days after making the treaty with them, they heard that the Gibeonites were their neighbors living among them. Can you imagine how Joshua must have just kind of wanted to crawl under a rock somewhere? Oh my gosh. God, you told us to take everyone, not to leave anyone alive. And we've just made a deal that we have to honor, that we have to obey with the devil. Basically is what it was. They made a deal with the Gibeonites. Now, and they were just trying to save their own tails. Where did I leave off at on verse 17, I think? But the Israelites did not attack them because the leaders of the community had sworn an oath to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. Then the whole community grumbled against the leaders. All the leaders answered them, "We have sworn an oath." I'm going to read the rest of this chapter. "We have sworn an oath to them." They also said, "Let them live." So the Gibeonites became woodcutters and water carriers for the whole community as the leaders had promised them. Joshua summoned the Gibeonites and some of them. "Why did you deceive us by telling us you live far away from us, when in fact you live among us? Therefore you are cursed and will always be slaves and woodcutters, water carriers for the house of my God." The Gibeonites answered him, "It was clearly communicated to your servants that the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you all the land and to destroy all the inhabitants of the land before you. We greatly feared for our lives because of you, and that is why we did this. Now we are in your hands. Do to us whatever you think is right." This is what Joshua did to them. He delivered them from the hands of the Israelites, and they did not kill them. On that day, he made them woodcutters and water carriers as they are today for the community and for the Lord's altar at the place he would choose. Now, when it says unto this day, it's talking about unto this day of Joshua. It doesn't mean unto this day we're in right now, okay? I used to apply it that way. I used to say, well, if it says unto this day and it's in the Bible, I was taking it so literal. It means it has to be today, Brother Ed, that it's still going on. But we take from this. It took Israel that 3 days to learn that they had been duped from a town 25 miles away. Proverbs 12:19 says, "A lying tongue lasts only for a moment." How many of you have ever used this big, long phrase said, "if only"? If only. I really think this was Joshua's words in Hebrew. If only I had sought the counsel of the Lord. If only. Church, I don't want to have us ever in that point that we're a church sitting around in a business meeting or something like that saying, oh, if only we would have took the counsel of God. That's why prayer is so important. Now, prayers, I'm not going to preach on prayer tonight, but I want to hit on prayer again because we did sing about it, so that makes it okay, Ron, right? Didn't we sing about it? One of the greatest songs ever written, Sweet Hour of Prayer. This drop and rise to meet the everlasting. I thought of Brother Kelly Broughton when I heard it. I just thought of him because I knew how he was so looking forward to seeing Jesus, and I just thought of him as he left this body and went to be with the Lord. But in that, we don't need to be caught in that time. If only. You know, sometimes we as Christians don't need to jump ahead of ourselves. We're impatient. If the Israelites would have said, tell you what, Gibeonites, give us 4 days. We're going to seek the counsel of God, and then we'll get back to you. I've had those days in my life that I have turned and said, oh God, if I would have just sought your counsel. God, if I would have just asked you, if I hadn't have just jumped in with both feet because I just knew I had the right answer. But they didn't. And now they were told they had to hold to their word. So when Moses led the Israelites out of the wilderness, it says they grumbled against Moses' leadership and against God. Now they were grumbling again, the Israelites were, but this time for a good reason. Because Joshua and the leaders of Israel had let them down. The leaders let them down. Hadn't really thought about this in the points, but that's a good thing for the church to know, that the leaders or sometimes of the church are going to let you down. Sometimes they're not going to always do what you think is right or always do what the word says. They're going to mess up, and you need to have a treaty with them and a promise that you'll make them woodcutters and water carriers. That was a joke, but it wasn't very funny. Okay. But the grumbling. The bulk of the Israelites, though, they wanted to go ahead and destroy the Gibeonites. They wanted to go ahead and go against their promise, against their treaty. They said, let's do it, let's kill them. But Joshua and the leaders, they knew they couldn't do this because the treaty that had been made was made between them and God, and they could not touch them. Christian, you made a treaty between you and God however many years ago, however many months ago, when you placed your faith in Jesus Christ. You made a treaty with God, and that treaty is just like the one Joshua made with the Gibeonites. It can never be broken. It can never be broken. It's always going to be, God is always going to honor. So they get there in verse 20, and then they're stating why they will allow them to live. We're going to let you live. But you're going to be woodcutters and water carriers. And in Joshua in 23 through 27, he asked them why they had deceived him. Why did you deceive us? They deceived for their own life. I want you to think about that really closely, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the United States of America today on campuses all across this nation that we have Christian kids at, that they may be put to the point, do you choose Israel or do you choose Palestine? And they may face death for that very choice. That's what the Gibeonites were doing. They were trying to save themselves. But we as a coming into end times, I believe we need to know and to understand that we may even be put in that spot. Let's go to the book of Revelations, for instance. It says that there will be a mark put on their forehead or on their, is it their wrist or their hand? The back of their hand. What if you were told, well, your kids are going to die. You're going to die unless you get this little inscription of whatever it is put on the back of your hand or on your forehead. That day could be coming. We could see it. We could see it coming. Hopefully not. I pray for the kids older than me or the young kids because I know that that's a possibility that's coming, that their people are going to have to make that decision. But the Gibeonites had hoped to attain their freedom, but instead guaranteed their lostness. Because what they wanted was freedom, and what they got was slavery. Because Joshua, realizing he's messed up, not sought the counsel of God, and he says, you are not going to be free. You will be slaves to Israel. You know, we as Christians need to take some nuggets, golden nuggets from this chapter. Number one is to always seek God's counsel. Always seek God's counsel. Even if it seems minuscule. Sometimes we do things because, well, it's not that big a deal. I don't need to ask God. I know the answer already. No, you don't. It's not always what we think it is. Yes, God gives us common sense, but there are times that God expects us, even in the minuscule thoughts that we have, to seek Him and say, God, is this the right thing to do? Is this what I should be doing? So we're not to stray away from God's word. And second I said seeking counsel, but the second is not to stray away from God's word in all matters. Each of these seem to be a downfall that I suffer more often than anything else, is not seeking God's counsel in all matters. Because if I matter to God, everything about me matters. If you belong to God as a child of God, everything about you matters to God. God does already know all about you. He knows everything you're going to do, say, have said, and will say. But He wants us acknowledging. He wants us acknowledging for our own benefit to say, hey, God, I'm messed up again, and again, and again. These nuggets are not only meaningful for you and I as individuals, but they're just, if not almost as important to the church. That we follow and seek God's guidance in everything we do as a church. Not jump to conclusions, not jump to because, well, let's just, hey, that seems like a great idea. Hey, let's be at the Emmett Kelly Clown Festival this weekend, and we just thought of it last week because it's a good deal. Thought out plans are good deals when they involve God. Not just jumping into something because, it's something we should have been doing. Well, we should have maybe thought about it earlier. Amen? It's not something it's got to come through prayer and seeking God's counsel. And a lot of that comes from right here. There's only been one time that I've ever felt that God spoke to me and it was audible, and it wasn't God. I believe it was an angel. And that was when I hadn't surrendered to the ministry. I was working 24 hours a day. Well, I was on call 24 hours a day, working 7 days a week. Just been married, making that big money. I was a foreman, a supervisor of a warehouse in Salem, and I was on call 24 hours a day. I had the world by the hand, and God kept telling me I needed to preach. And I knew that. So I decided, and you probably all heard this, but I decided if I was smoking and drinking alcohol, God couldn't use me to preach. And I just bought a new pack of Winstons. Yes, I remember what I smoked 30 years ago. And right past the airport in Salem, I was on my way home about 3 a.m. I'd got called in about midnight after working a 16-hour shift, and I got called back in. And I was sitting in my little red Toyota pickup, and just after you cross, there's the Eagles Club out of Salem, and then there's that little dip and that little bridge. Right there on that little bridge, my little Toyota pickup just kind of, it was just like a light came on inside it. And something sitting next to me said, you either throw out your cigarettes and quit your drinking right now, or you're not going to make it home tonight. I pulled my cigarettes out and I littered in the road, threw them out. I went home and I got the beer that I had hid in the garage, so Diane wasn't sure, and I dumped it out and went in and I said, I got to have a talk with you. This is at 4 a.m. I wake my wife up. And you know what her words were? I've been waiting for you. I've been waiting for you. You need to go see my pastor in the morning. And you know what that sucker made me do? Preach the next Sunday night. Yeah, it wasn't nice. It wasn't good either, but I did it. But not seeking God's counsel, thinking we can do things on our own that'll keep God from having to use us to do whatever he wants us to do. It's not going to work. We can take this from the Old Testament. People say, oh, the Old Testament's not relevant. The Old Testament's got so much knowledge for us Christians that we can grasp onto and say, hey, we don't want to do what Israelites did. So I encourage you tonight to make it a serious concentration of this group, that we're on guard for the deception that may try to come in, that we're ready for it. And folks, there is nothing wrong, according to Scripture, for calling out deception for what it is. As a matter of fact, it's biblical that we do so, that we call it out. Father, I just come before your throne. I praise you and I thank you. And God, I thank you for this passage of Joshua, that it shows how your counsel is the most important thing that we can go after. And Father, as we get ready to enter this time of prayer, I just pray, God, that you would open our hearts and our minds, kingdom-wise, focus on the kingdom. And that, God, that you would show us who it is and what it is and where it is we're supposed to be, do, and talk to tomorrow, tonight. What we're supposed to be doing as a church to reach the kingdom. Father, I praise you and thank you for Jesus, and in his name I pray. Amen.